Hi, welcome back to Grit Gym. I'm Adam Reese, and today's question is, when and how do we stretch out the hamstrings? And I think one thing before we get into this to keep in mind is that the answers almost very, very rarely lie in the extremes. It's hard to be 100% right, it's hard to be 100% wrong. So there could be times when 99% of the time we do it this way, 99% of the time we don't do it at all. It just depends on the person, and there's a lot of variables when it comes to the human body. When there's pain, it's probably going to be a 99% no, don't stretch it. Go to a professional and have them guide you through what they think your rehabilitative process should be. Pre-workout, post-workout, during the workout, it all depends. Some people need to stretch out a lot, some people need to stretch out very, very little. And when it comes to the hamstring, a lot of people are stretching it out and they're doing the opposite of what they should actually be doing. Just because it's tight doesn't mean that you should stretch it, or just because it's stiff doesn't mean that you should stretch it. So pre-workout, some people need to be doing that before they work out every single time. Some people don't need to be doing it at all. Very rarely are you gonna have someone, or it's unlikely that you're gonna need to stretch out your hamstring during the workout. Post-workout, yeah, sure, usually it's just fine. Some people, though, don't need to be stretching out. If you're already loose, like if you can bend down and touch your palms to the ground, you don't probably need to be stretching your hamstring, although that is not the way that we want to stretch the hamstring anyway, which we'll go over here in a second. Daily, some people do need to do it daily. It just depends, like I said, it depends on the person. A really, really stiff person might need to stretch out the hamstring every single day, might need to just stretch out in general every single day, probably do. A really, really loose person is probably going to work more towards the stability end of the spectrum. What we're really looking for when we look at the hamstring is are the flexion and extension patterns on each side similar, like very, very similar. We want symmetry from right to left. That's the big thing that we're looking for when it comes to the hamstring. And the best way I got this described was, think of an athlete running with a pair of athletic shorts on one leg and a pair of Wrangler jeans on the other leg. They're gonna move pretty messy. And they're gonna get a lot of injuries. The second indicator of injury will be asymmetries. The first is pre-existing injury. So we want to look for symmetry between the extension of our hip. One of the ways that we're gonna rule out or rule in whether we need to be looking at the hamstring anyway is by looking at pelvic tilt. And I attempted to draw some up here. Neutral tilt would be the first one right here. Neutral tilt is something I've never seen, but it's very rare to have a perfectly neutral tilt, but it's where the hips lay parallel to the floor, okay? So they probably have they have great joint centration in their hips if they have a neutral pelvic tilt. Most people are probably going to sit towards the anterior side, okay, where their hips tilt downward. They kind of walk around with like kind of a Donald Duck butt back here. And a lot of the time people will feel like they have stiff hamstrings with an anterior pelvic tilt, but they really don't have stiff hamstrings. The reason that their hamstrings feel tight is because they're tilted down like this, so their hamstrings are already on stretch back here. They're already, because the butt's sticking up in the air, okay? So it's sticking up and it's pulling on their hamstrings already because it's because of a hip flexor pulling it down. Can be because of weak abdominals, can be because of tons of things. You could write books on it. The other way is a posterior pelvic tilt. And a posterior pelvic tilt, your butt is actually pointed the opposite direction of the anterior pelvic tilt. So it's kind of pointed upward. And with a posterior pelvic tilt, this could actually be a hamstring issue. Usually people with a posterior pelvic tilt have kind of a flat back, and they kind of have like saggy butt syndrome, maybe you call it, I don't know. But typically this person is going to have a stiff hamstring. And that when you're stretching a person with posterior pelvic tilt, you have to be very careful because you can actually just pull their hip, or you can pull their hip out of alignment. You're not really stretching their hip, you're stretching their low back, okay? And that might be okay with a person with anterior pelvic tilt, but with a person with anterior pelvic tilt, you don't really need to be stretching their hamstrings probably anyway. You need to be stretching their flexors. But you gotta be careful with either of these two groups because they're all screwed up with that, okay? So when we're dealing with a posterior pelvic tilt, they might have too long of a hip flexor, and that's giving them too much, or they could have too tight of a hamstring. We don't know. You'd have to look at the person and find out where they're going with that. Now, when we get to how we want to stretch the hamstring, bending over and touching your toes is the worst hamstring stretch that you could probably do. The sit and reach is just as bad. These are not hamstring stretches. You might feel it a little bit in your hamstring, but really this is a lower back stretch. Okay, you're putting your muscle, when you lean over like that, your muscle is tense. Your hamstring is going to tense up. Okay, that's not going to allow it to stretch very well. Not the way that we want to anyway. A much better stretch would be to lay on the ground with something underneath your low back, like a rolled up towel. Grab a belt or a rope and put that around the ball of your foot and pull that back toward your face. That's going to be a much healthier, much better way to stretch out your hamstring if you do need to stretch your hamstring. But you don't even know. And this is what you're really looking for, just to lay it down basically, is are you similar, like extremely similar, like almost exactly the same on your right and your left leg. That's what you're really looking for. Otherwise, and when we get into pelvic tilts, that is more of a safety thing, and it's something that you really do need to look at though. And that's how we that is how we look at the hamstring and kind of the screening process that goes on there, where and how we figure out, does this person need stretching of the hamstring, or do they need to be left alone to stretch other things? Can we rule this out? Can we rule this in? It just depends. Like I said, the answers hardly ever lie in the extremes. It's hard to be 100% right. It's hard to be 100% wrong.